Alexa be crazy. What up, guys? Welcome to Fantasy Live. What's the deal? Thank you for coming back. Hope you guys are having a good day. I just got back from the gym. I do have some more gym videos coming soon. Stay tuned for that. But today we're going to be focusing on photography, manual mode specifically, and why you should use manual mode. If you're not using manual mode, get on manual mode now, today. Learn it, practice it, and get it together. You need to be on manual mode, guys, if you're shooting photography. So today what we're actually going to talk about in regards to manual mode is what is manual mode and what are the three elements, aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, that you're going to need to get the hang of in order to master manual mode. Okay? So first thing we're going to talk about is what is manual mode, right? Manual mode is the mode that allows you to adjust the individual elements in an image in order to get that image where you need it as far as exposure goes. So to put it simply is you use manual mode to manually control the exposure of your image. Those three elements, as I mentioned before, are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. You may hear aperture also referred to as f-stop. It's very important that you do try and learn manual mode if you're thinking about getting serious into photography, even if it's just as your hobby. If you really want to take advantage of what the camera can do and also take advantage of your creativity, you have to master manual mode, or you have to at least understand what ISO, shutter speed, and aperture are, so that you can take your photography to the next level, not just with image quality, but like I said, being able to take what's in your head and put it on the canvas. If you're just shooting on auto every time, you're going to come out with the same kind of image every time. You can't control any kind of depth of field or the exposure. Now maybe you've heard of manual mode before, maybe you have a camera, you know, maybe you have your first DSLR, you've been taking pictures for a while, but you haven't really stepped into the manual mode world. Maybe you've heard of it from photography forums or online, or maybe you have no idea what it is. Maybe you do know what it is, but you're just kind of intimidated by the concept of manual mode and having to adjust all these settings on your own. But I can assure you it's not as hard as you may think once you grasp what aperture, ISO, and shutter speed actually are. Let's get right into those three elements. We're going to start with aperture. Aperture is what controls how wide or how narrow, how open or how closed your depth of field is, right? So the easiest way I can break it down is to think of it as the pupil in your eyeball, right? So you have your eyelid, you have your pupil, and inside of your eye you have some kind of receptor that takes in the light from around us and turns that light into an image, right? So your eye is exactly like the camera. Now the aperture specifically is the pupil. It's what gets smaller and gets bigger to allow more or less light in, right? So the smaller it is, it's going to allow less light in. The bigger it gets, it's going to allow more light in. So in general, when you have less light in the scene or the environment, you want to open that aperture up so you can get more light in. So just like our pupils in our eyes, when I'm in a light and bright environment, they're going to shrink, right? Because it's so bright that it doesn't need to open up that wide because it's getting a lot of light. When you go into a dark room, your pupils dilate because it needs to let in as much light as possible in order to see what's around you. That's why sometimes it'll take you a while to adjust when you go into a dark room. Your pupils need to adjust and open up and let in more lights for your eye to process, right? It's the same thing for a camera, except that now you have the ability to control when and where you want that to let more light in or not. Now a wide open aperture means it's a lower number, right? So if I have my aperture or my f-stop set at 1.8, that's a wide open aperture. Now the higher you go with that number, if you get up to f10, f11, f12 and up, that's a high f-stop. That's going to bring the aperture ring in and make it really tiny, right? So that's going to narrow, it's going to make your depth of field shrink. But what's also going to happen is you're going to get more focus on what's in the frame. So when you bring your aperture down or your f-stop down, you open that aperture ring to get more light in. But what's also going to happen is your focal plane is also going to get smaller. So for instance, if I have my fist here, and I have this on a f1.8, my fist may be in focus, but my face, which is directly behind it, will start to get blurry, and then the items behind my head will be totally blurry because it doesn't have the ability to focus on everything in the frame. Now, if I have my fist here and I have it on f11 or a higher f-stop, which means I've brought my aperture ring down, I get less light in, but the ability for the lens to focus on my fist, my face, what's in the background is heightened, right? So you'll get more in focus with the higher f-stop, less in focus with the lower f-stop or at a wide open aperture. Let's say you're doing landscape photography. If you're doing landscape photography and you have a whole scene in front of you, you don't want this part to be in focus and this part over here be blurry, right? You want the whole thing to be in focus. Like, let's say you're taking a picture of buildings or a forest from a distance or some mountains. You don't want this mountain right here or this piece of this mountain to be in focus, and these mountains, everything around it is out of focus. So you wouldn't want to use a low f-stop or a low aperture or a wide open aperture in that scenario. You would want to use a high f-stop. So you want to close down that ring. You'll get less light in, but all that will be in focus. And you can use the other two settings, which we'll get into, shutter speed and ISO, to bring that light back up where you need it accordingly. On the flip side of that, if you do want a lot of bokeh in your scene and you're doing something like portrait photography maybe, or macro photography, anything where you want to focus on one subject in the image and everything else can be blurry, you know, you want that real nice bokeh effect that you see in portrait photography. That's the perfect time to lower your aperture and set your aperture as your main priority. So you want to set that as low as you can and then adjust the other two settings to accommodate. So hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of what aperture is. You'll have an even better understanding of it by the time we talk about shutter speed and ISO, right? Because they all work together. They work tandemly to give you the same result. So what is shutter speed is what we're going to get into now. Shutter speed is the setting that's going to determine how long the shutter or the eyelid of the camera is open, right? So aperture is, like I said, is comparable to your pupil of your eye, right? Now the shutter is more comparable to your eyelid itself. The only difference is that our eyes are open, you know, normally open. The shutter is normally closed in the camera, right? So it's closed. When you want to take a picture, it opens and it closes again. So it's closed, you press that button and it opens and it closes. Now, depending on how you have your shutter speed set is what's going to determine how long it's open and then when it closes again. So obviously, the longer you set it, the higher your shutter speed, or the longer it's open, the more light is going to be allowed to come in. It's like opening a floodgate, right? The longer you have those gates open, the more water can flood in. When you close those gates, the water stops coming in. So it's the same thing with light. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So for example, 1/60th, if you have the shutter speed set to 1/60th, that's going to be a slower shutter speed than 1/300th. So if you don't want to do all the maths and think about it like that, you can just think about it as, okay, the second half of the fraction, or the denominator of this fraction, is going to be the speed, right? So 60 is going to be slower than 300. So like I said, the longer you have the shutter speed open, the more light you can bring into the sensor, right? Alexa be crazy. Her ears too good. How she hear me? I didn't even say nothing. Out here talking about Alexa. She's gonna say. One example of when using shutter speed would be hugely beneficial is in nighttime photography, astrophotography, or sports photography. So if you're dealing with a subject that moves really fast, or it's moving in the frame and it's really fast action, you want to use a really fast shutter speed so that you're able to freeze that image, right? So if you have a soccer player running down the field, you want to be able to snap them without any kind of motion blur, unless you desire a motion blur photo. But usually when you're taking sports photography, you want to freeze that image and have them in the air or running, just froze it, just, you know, just. So in order to do that, you have to have a really fast shutter speed. But if you want to do night photography or astrophotography, where it's really dark outside, there's not much light to be had, right? There's not much natural light. So you can open the shutter speed for a really long time, up to 30 seconds in some cases, or longer, if you want to do some kind of astrophotography and capture the stars, or capture anything moving, capture something that is moving, and you want to have motion blur on that photo. This is what will give you that motion blur, or allow you to get in more light in a situation where there is none, or it's very hard to come by. So if you have that shutter speed set at 30 seconds, it's going to be closed, and as soon as you hit that shutter button, it's going to open for 30 seconds. So that whole time, light's going to be coming in. So even in a dark environment, the sensor is going to be able to capture enough light, and slowly like just adding to the image, right? So that when you get that final processed image, it's lit up the way you need it to be. It's like having a big pool, right? And like I mentioned earlier, the floodgates. If you have a huge pool, you need that shutter, or those floodgates, to be open longer for all that water to fill the pool. It's the same thing for an image, right? So the darker it is, you need that shutter speed open longer so that that light can fill the image. So I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about ISO real quick. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor that's inside the camera. So whatever light that you're letting in via the shutter speed or the aperture ring, ISO is what's controlling the sensitivity of the sensor that light is hitting. The lower the sensitivity, which is somewhere around, ISO 100, 200, that's a low ISO. All the way up to some cameras 64,000. I have a Rebel T3i, which is a beginner series camera. I think mine goes up to 6400, right? So it's 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. So it doubles in sensitivity. A lower ISO at 100 or 200 is what you're going to use when you have a really, really bright environment. You don't need the actual sensitivity of the camera or of the sensor to be that high, because you have so much light coming in, right? So the darker the environment, like we talked about, astrophotography, night photography, or just in a dim lit situation where just adjusting the shutter speed and the aperture ring itself is not giving you the look you need or the look you want, that's when you're going to go to ISO, and you're going to bump up that ISO to make the sensitivity of the sensor more sensitive, so that whatever light is getting in there, even if it's not a lot, it's gonna absorb as much as it can. Now the downside to this is that the higher you go, the higher you bump up that ISO, the more grainy or the more noise you're gonna get in your image. The general rule of thumb is you want to keep the ISO as low as possible by adjusting the other two settings, and then go from there. Unless, of course, you're going for that look, you're going for that noise and grain. For instance, if you're shooting a shot and you want it to look vintage or older, or have that look of history to it, that's when you would bump up that ISO, and that's one thing you can do that will allow you to get that grain and that noise to the image that can sometimes add character to the image, if that's what you want in that situation. We talked about aperture, we talked about shutter speed, we talked about ISO. I went through those pretty quick, so now I'm going to try to put all those together for you. Now, a good place to start when it comes to setting your aperture, your shutter speed, and ISO is what do you want out of this image, or what's your environment? Is it dark? Is it light outside? Are you shooting something still? Are you shooting something moving? Do you want a blurry background? Do you want everything to be in focus? These are the things that you want to consider when going into a shoot, or when you're about to take a photo. What do you want out of this photo? And from there, you can decide how you want to adjust your settings accordingly. Personally, like in my situation, I like to shoot a lot of bokeh images. I have my zoom camera, my 70 to 300. I can choose a subject and I want to focus in on that subject and have stuff blurry in the background, right? Get that bokeh effect. So a lot of times I'll start with my aperture. I'll start with the lowest aperture I can at that focal length that I'm at. So if I'm working with a zoom lens that's not a prime lens, it has a range of aperture. So let's say f3 to 4.5 or something like that. The more you zoom in, sometimes that aperture, the lowest aperture that you can go to will go up. So if you have it all the way zoomed out, let's say if I have a 70 to 300, I'm at 70. then the lowest aperture I'll be able to go to is 3, right? So, but if I zoom in to 200, my lowest aperture I may be able to go to is 4. And then all the way out, it's going to be 4.5. But in general, if I want a blurry background, I want to put that aperture setting on the lowest possible f-stop number. That's going to give me that blurry background. Now you can also get blurry backgrounds without a lower f-stop number, especially working with zoom lenses. You know, if you separate your subject from the background, so if you're doing a portrait and your subject is 15 feet from you, but the main background that's behind her is 100 feet, 200 feet away, the farther away the background is from your subject, that'll also allow you to get some really nice bokeh. But like I said, if you're shooting at nighttime, or let's say you're shooting a waterfall, and you want to have that water look like it's in motion, it's all blurred together. You may have seen these effects. A lot of people, I'll put some pictures up for example. A lot of people love to take these kind of photos. You would want a long shutter speed. So having that long shutter speed is what's gonna leave that shutter open and continuously take an image for that set amount of time that you set it at. So if you set a shutter speed for 3 seconds and you're filming a waterfall, it's going to capture an image for 3 seconds. So this water that was here in 3 seconds is going to be here. So it's going to capture the picture from here to here. So you're going to get that blur effect through that whole range of time, right? So that'd be a perfect time to set your shutter speed as your priority. You know you're going to want a blurry image. You know you're going to want to get that motion blur, so you're going to set a slower shutter speed, and then you're going to adjust your aperture and your ISO to fit what shutter speed you have already selected, because that's going to be your priority in that situation. Now, like I said before, sometimes if you're in a night situation where it's just really dark, and if you have your ISO set at 200 or 100, no matter how low you bump your f-stop or how wide open your aperture is, you're going to need to bump that ISO up a little bit, unless you're shooting, of course, like 20-second shutter speed. You can also do that. But so the priority on which one you want to set is what you want to focus on first. You know, what image are you going for? So, and then from there you can determine, okay, I need to adjust my shutter speed first, or I need to make aperture my priority, or ISO. So like I said, these things work in conjunction with each other. So there's no right or wrong way to do any of these, you know, things, or adjust any of these settings. It's all what you want out of the image, right? So depending on what you want, you're going to adjust these settings different. My suggestion is just to play around with it and practice, but get yourself on manual, get off of that automatic mode, get on manual so you can really get some quality images and some really cool creative images out of your photo shoots. So after you shoot in manual a while, you'll learn what you like, you'll learn your style of shooting more, you'll learn more about yourself. So not only is that better for you as a photographer, but shooting in manual becomes that much more easy, because now you know, okay, going into a certain scene, I'm gonna want it to look like this because that's just how I like it. So you, right off the bat, you know, okay, I'm gonna set my ISO at 400 for this scene. I'm gonna use a really low f-stop, and then from there I'll adjust my shutter speed to get the exposure where I want it, right? So the more you shoot in manual, the more you learn about yourself, the easier it is and the faster it becomes to get good photos right off the bat. Now, sometimes you may have to mess around with the settings a little bit to get the photo right, and you'll have some bad days where it's just like, I just couldn't get the settings right. Like, I could not get it right. But in those situations, you're probably not going to end up with any better result if you leave it in auto anyways, right? It's just the conditions of the environment. Sometimes they're just not ideal. So don't worry about that. You're going to struggle a little bit, but switch that little knob to manual and get shooting, and let's do it. That's it for me today, guys. Hopefully I kept this short. I don't even know. I feel like I've been here a while, but depending on how much I cut out of here. But if you like this video, make sure to like it. Comment down below. Let me know what you think. Are you shooting in manual? Has this video helped you or inspired you to go shoot in manual? So get out there, put it in manual, and start shooting. Let's get it, baby. You know what I'm saying?